Yep, so today is a general overview of this new release, 2020.3, as you said, Ryan. So this is not a detail, it's not a getting started. We've already got some webinars and some great content if you want to get started on the basics. This is going to give you an overview of the features that are sort of the main headlines for this release. So first of all, I'm going to take a look at showing you all about execution containers. So this was available as early access in 2020.2, and we've built on it again, and it's still early access in 2020.3, but it's fully available for you to have a play around with the caveat that, you know, there might be the odd little bug in there somewhere. Not that we know of any right now. The ability to use containers in the execution environment for the deployment process. So I'll just summarize that pretty much. Then Ryan's going to take a look at Runbooks++. So this is building on customer feedback we've had from our excellent operations Runbooks, and just really nice improvements we've got there. And as part of that, he's going to look at the process editor improvements we've got. Then going to go back to me again with another early access feature, which is Octopus Linux Docker image. So the ability to run the Octopus server within a Linux Docker image container. And then I'll hand back to Ryan, where he'll take a look at the Jenkins pipeline support that's been added. Okay, so let's move on over and get stuck straight into the demo. So we're going to take a look at execution containers here. And to show you this, I've got a really basic project here. So the first thing I've got is literally just one step, and all that step's doing is it's running a very, very basic Azure CLI script to get the version and then show us the information about a resource group. What we're really interested here is actually this worker pool section. So currently this step is running on the default worker pool. And on this instance of Octopus, the default worker pool is actually using the built-in worker on my Octopus server, which is running on a Windows machine. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to create a release, and I'm going to deploy that through to development. And we'll just be able to see very quickly that it's just performing those simple tasks running, as you can see here, on the Octopus server.
So this is the state before execution containers come into play, right?
Exactly. This is just very basic, just basically as you get Octopus. There's been no configuration of any worker machines or anything at all. So here we are. You can see it's printed out the version of the Azure CLI and that basic information. So I want to change this to use execution containers. And before we do, let's just maybe have a think about why you would want to do that. So I've often been in the situation where there's multiple projects in a company I'm working for. I'm deploying various different systems. And the deployment processes have reliance on different versions of applications, different frameworks, etc. So you end up having maybe a worker pool per project or a worker machine that's just got software bloat. I'm pretty sure you've been there too, Ryan.
I'm the latter. I'm not disciplined enough to set up separate workers for different projects. I have one worker to rule them all. It has everything I need installed on it, or it used to anyway, before execution containers.
Exactly, which is fine until it dies and you've got to remember what you had on there.
Oh yeah, that's the downside to that approach.
So with execution containers, you can have a worker machine or a pool of worker machines that have the Octopus tentacle installed and Docker, and that's it. So the software dependencies required for the deployment process are managed within the execution container Docker images. I can't tell you how useful this is from an administration perspective. I mean, you know, if you want to use a different software version or an entirely different framework, you just change the Docker file, publish it to the registry, and it can be used across those workers. Now, with execution containers on Octopus, you can get up and running without any Docker knowledge at all. This is a really great way to sort of get up and running that I think our engineers have really given us all a head start with this, because we've got these worker tool images, and there's one for Ubuntu and one on Windows. 'Cause you could, your worker machine with Docker on could be a Windows machine, could be a Linux machine. And on this worker tools image, we have a lot of frameworks and CLIs and things like that. It's essentially what you would get on the built-in worker in Octopus. And in here you can see the versions of things, and there was actually an addition I noticed yesterday for the Google CLI has been added. So, it's always being looked at. So you can just take this image, reference that, and you're up and running straight away. And we'll show how to do that in a minute. For this process, for my demo today, as you saw, it was simply a very, very basic Azure CLI script. So all I need is the Azure CLI. So I've created my own Docker file, and it's based on Ubuntu. It's installing some dependencies, and then it's installing the Azure CLI, and that is it. So this gives us a nice slim machine, a container to run on. And so I've just published that to my own registry on Docker.
I've done a few custom images myself for a few different toolings like Terraform, Firebase, those types of things that I'm running locally in my projects.
It's once you start getting sort of the hang of it, you do find that, you can play around with it, and you find, you get your core set that you will use for most of your deployments from what I've found. I don't know if you're the same.
Pretty much, yeah. I have a few container images that I use. They're either the ones that are provided by whoever makes what I'm using, or if for whatever reason they're not already there, I'll confess I run some of this stuff on Raspberry Pis, and ARM containers aren't very common. So I've made a few myself for a few things.
Excellent. Okay, so let's go into Octopus and work out how we're going to do this to change this process. So the first thing we need to do, as I mentioned, this is an early access feature. So you need to go into the configuration menu, and in features, just set it to enabled. And that's it. It'll be available to use. Next thing to do is to make sure that we know where to get those images from. So I've gone and I've already set up an external feed that's looking at Docker using their container registry. And lastly, you need your worker pool. You need a worker that's got Docker on, at least one. I've created a new worker pool here, and I've got one Linux machine in there, and it's just got Docker installed. So let's go back to that project, and we'll take a look at, first of all, variables. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a variable which is going to reference the name of the image. So, oops. Okay, and in there, I'm just going to copy across the name of that image. So I think something that caught you out, Ryan, was that you do need to make sure you include the tag at this point, don't you?
Yeah, that was one thing that I missed when I was originally setting it up. These are not packages. These are just a container that's listed as part of the steps. So when you create the release, it's not going to ask you for that container version. It's set directly in that field, which is nice because if you're very sure that it won't cause problems down the road, you could actually set that tag to latest, and then you never have to like update your step, as long as the latest is always what you want. And that's probably more applicable to like a Docker repo that you're managing. I probably wouldn't do that for Docker hubs where you're not controlling it.
Sure. No, yeah, you're playing a risky game then, aren't you? So I've set that as a variable because it's quite likely that you'll use that container multiple times in your deployment process. So if you want to use a different container or a different version, a different tag, then you'd only want to update it in that one place. So variables, we all love variables. Okay, so save that. So worker pool. So we need to set it to use that Linux worker pool. And then you can see this has appeared since we switched on that feature. And we need to change it from running directly on the worker machine to running inside a container on the worker. So right here, it's pre-filled the container registry because I've only got one registered in my settings. And something Ryan actually pointed out to me down here, the direct links there, which will pre-fill this value here. So it's a really nice shortcut. So where I showed you those Octopus Worker Tools images, you can just click on this. And I think you said, is this dynamic, Ryan?
It is dynamic. So as we update those, and you may notice it if you open that tab like very quickly when you first load the process, we're pulling the latest tag for each of those images and putting it dynamically in the step template for you. So that loads with the latest version, and then you click the link, the use latest for either whichever one you want, and that will populate it to the text field. Now, we don't update what's in the text field automatically. That would be bad, but we do update that help text that is below
Just
there.
Yeah, it's just a really nice touch to, again, get you started with using these containers. But today, what I'm going to do is link it to that variable that I created. And it's now going to use that AZ CLI image. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch that to Bash because you saw that my Docker file was so simple. It literally had the Azure CLI, so there wasn't any PowerShell core or anything installed. Okay, so let's just double check. I've done all that. Yep, that's all set. So that's all we need to do.
So the main difference here is... to kind of clarify my understanding, it's like the previous option of running directly on the worker, you need the AZ CLI and everything installed on the worker directly. With this setup, you only need Docker installed.
That's absolutely right. Yep, Docker, and as long as you've got your Octopus tentacle to register it, that is all you need. And okay, so let's deploy this through to development. So the first thing you're going to notice here is there's an extra step. There's a step to acquire packages, and in there it's doing this Docker pull as you would do in the command line to pull down that image from Docker Hub. And you can see actually what's a really brilliant thing is it's not going to pull it because it's already got it. So you could set up a runbook to pre-pull all of your Docker images down onto your worker machines on a regular basis if need be, so that your deployment processes run through much faster.
Yeah, that's a handy tip. So you don't have to wait because some of those those images could be pretty large and take a bit to download. Exactly. And the worker tools one that we supply is pretty large. I think it's about 3.5 gig, just the Linux one. So it is large, but if you pre-pull it, it's absolutely fine. So here we are. It's printed out. It's got a different version of the Azure CLI to the other one, just to highlight that it has done it somewhere differently. And that's that. So just to summarize, you can already use workers to offload work from your Octopus server for maybe just to retain the resources the Octopus server needs, or to maybe separate the security context that you want to run your deployment process in. This takes it a step further and enables you to run that process within a container on those worker machines. So, and it just really, really simplifies your dependency management. Okay, over to you, Ryan. All right, well, let's take a look at some improvements to Runbooks. So I have my dashboard ready to go. I'm going to jump into my Azure Terraform project. And Lianne, the first thing you may notice is it's dropped me directly in the overview for the operations tab, and the deployments tab is collapsed.
Yes. Now, am I right in thinking that's not until you've actually created a runbook?
Right. So if I created a new project, they're going to both be expanded by default. But once you create one or the other, it kind of collapses what you're not using. If I was using both,
right,
deployments would be expanded by default.
Cool.
So, and this is a lot of the changes I'm going to show you here. These are all feedback we got from the early adopters of Runbooks. They've been out for 8 or 9 months now. And we got a lot of feedback, and this was one of them. If I have a project such as this one that only uses Runbooks, hide the deployments from me so I don't see them, and drop me into operations directly. Some of our astute viewers may have noticed during your demo that your deployments was expanded, but your operations were collapsed. So in a situation that was reversed, operations is still there to add if you need it, but is going to be collapsed and take up less space. So that's kind of one of the first things you'll notice that we've changed about Runbooks. Lianne, you may notice I have a few red X's on my overview.
Yes, I did notice.
Sometimes Azure and I don't get along. Usually we do. Most of the time we do. Sometimes I make mistakes.
Surely not.
Surely not. No. So temporary mistakes. They always get fixed eventually. One thing you may notice, though, or one thing that if you've used Runbooks, this cycle of like failing a Runbook and then going back to process to update it, or the variables to update it and then coming back, could be a little bit tedious. So we've added some quick navigation in. So directly from this breadcrumb of the name of the Runbook, I can jump directly back to the process. And I can go in and update the template from there. So just
this is something that we've really noticed recently, isn't it? That the things we're getting through from the UX team are really helping us reduce the number of clicks to move about the UI, and I think I love it, really.
I do too, because I don't know about you, but I've written more Runbooks recently than deployment processes. Like ever since they come out, I'm like, oh, a lot of the stuff I do are actually Runbooks. So I've been just, yeah. So all of these improvements have been great for me. You may notice I'm also using some container images here, one of those that I mentioned that I custom built. So from the process, before we continue with our Runbook updates, UI updates, I do want to mention the one change to the process editor. I'm going to start by adding a step. And this is not a Runbook change. This works with deployments and Runbooks. It's the ability to jump back and forth between these steps. And this is really a bit of the configuration of code feature that we're releasing as we build it. So this was built in advance of the bigger feature, but now you can add multiple steps. You can change multiple steps. Previously, every time you jump back and forth, you have to save like each one. Every step I add, I'm saving it. And a atomic like operation per step. Now I can set up a whole process, I can edit a whole process, and until I hit that save button, like they haven't gone through. And you can even see that it's telling me I have not provided all of the information for each of the steps. So that is the process editor improvements that we've released as part of Config as Code. That's like our big, flagship feature of the year, but we're releasing it as we can get functionality done in smaller pieces. So that's one nice improvement we have. I use this a lot because a lot of times I need to refer back to previous steps to get like maybe the name of a variable I used or some piece of output from it. And,
it definitely stops, having multiple tabs open all the time and stuff like that, doesn't it?
It does. So that is that improvement. And I'm going to now discard these changes because they will not help my Runbook succeed, and look at a few run settings we've added to the settings tab of each individual Runbook. So these aren't global settings for the Runbooks. These are at the per Runbook level within your project. And the first one is to be able to scope it to environments. One piece of feedback we got when we first launched is you could run a Runbook in any environment in the space, regardless of the project it was in. So it didn't take the project lifecycle into account, which makes sense because Runbooks don't really use the life cycles, but you also couldn't limit it to anything. So those were a few things that the Runbook users asked for. So now I can come in and say, you know what, this one is specifically for development or maybe development and test. And I'll only be able to run that Runbook in those environments. The other option is I could choose, hey, it can run in any environment that's in the lifecycle used by the project. And that's plural. If you don't use channels today, you only have one, or if you don't use any extra channels today in your deployments, you only have one lifecycle. So it'll be whatever environments are in that lifecycle. But if you do have multiple lifecycles, maybe you've got a version 2 lifecycle or a channel, a version 2 channel or a hotfix that has some extra environments in, this will be a union of all the environments and all the life cycles in your deployment processes channels. So a few options there to add in for scoping your runbook to certain environments. The next one is being able to set the failure mode per runbook. So I can use the default, which is whatever my target environment is. So if it's I'm deploying to development, and if it fails, no problem. But in production, maybe I won't go guided failure mode. The default is to use whatever the environment says. You can choose this or change this to only use guided failure mode or to never use guided failure mode. And then again, this is a per runbook setting. Lastly, on the settings front, probably my favorite setting that I can come in and change is the retention policy. Because these are not tied to a life cycle, it doesn't use the retention policy on the life cycle that your project uses. And the default is it saves 100 runs per environment, which is good if you want to keep a lot of that data, a lot of that history. Maybe you've got some regulatory requirements that you have to fulfill. Maybe you want to click that keep all button. But if you don't, and maybe you're generating a lot of artifacts or using a lot of packages with these runbook runs, maybe you want to scale that down to something like 10 per environment. I usually drop it down to like 3 per environment. For me, most of mine are just personal things, like personal projects. I don't need to keep that much history. So being able to set that is a big improvement. Again, another one requested from our early adopters. So thank you for everybody who has set up runbooks and send in that feedback. It has helped greatly improve that feature in Octopus. Now, before I hand it back to Lianne, I do have one more addition to runbooks to show, and that is the runbook command has been added to the CLI. So you can, if you're using the CLI today in any of your build processes or just as part of your daily work, you can call octo run runbook. You can provide a space, the project, the runbook you're running, the environment, and a whole lot of other options. So things like if you're deploying to certain tenants, if you want to use a specific snapshot, if you don't provide that, I'm using the publish snapshot. So that one, quote unquote, should work. We'll see. But again, a lot of different options there that you can get to via the help runbook command. So if you wanted to kind of sort through those and see what you need to provide, or certain things like maybe scheduling that runbook for in the future is also an option there. I'll go ahead and run this to see the output that comes out. So again, this has been added to the latest version of the Octopus CLI, and it's available for you to use today. And you know what? We don't really need to watch this run because it's just going to be the standard output you see, but you can see it is running there. And also it'll save me any embarrassment if it does happen to fail. So I'm going to sneak it back over to Lianne, and we're going to look at more Linux and more Docker. Is that right?
It's all about Linux and Docker for me at the moment. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the Octopus container to run Octopus server as a Linux container. So this has been asked for quite some time by a number of people who want to have the ability to run an Octopus from a Linux image. So this image, along with Windows Docker image, is based on the same code that powers our Octopus cloud. So you can self-host Octopus on the operating system of your choice. Okay, so let's take a look at this Docker Compose file, which you will actually find on a blog written by Matt Casperson. This is where I've taken this one from. And he's written a really awesome blog, which we will be putting a link to in our follow-up email. And it goes into this in far more detail. So this Docker Compose file is consisting of 2 images. The first one is the SQL Server image, and that's going to create our database for us. Well, create the server for our database to be on. And secondly, we've got the Octopus server section. So that's got a number of parameters going into that. There are also other options that you can pass in. And it's going to be exposed on port 8080. So for the parameters for this, I've got a .m file. And the first thing I want to say about this is before you do anything, please change the passwords. Do not use the default passwords. Next, the things you need to make sure you change are the end user license agreement for both SQL Server and Octopus. And you might want to change the version number. There's also a space for you to put your license key and a number of other things which correlate across to that Docker Compose YAML. Okay, so let's spin that up. That's going through, it's spinning up SQL Server, and then once it spins up the Octopus container, it will run any schema changes that need to create the database for your backend of Octopus. You can see it's performing those scripts now. Okay, let's hop across, and it won't be up yet, I don't think. No, but it won't be too long.
Just a little too fast for Docker.
Yeah, it's just to show the magic to prove that this is what I'm going to browse to.
Oh, yeah, that's smart.
Okay, there it's running the schema scripts, and okay, so that will be ready now. So I do have the default passwords right now, but I am going to prune these containers the minute this webinar is over. So there we go. So that's given us just a nice locally running Docker instance of Octopus. And I have to say I use this quite often just to sort of spin up a nice clean instance and give myself something to play with if there's a new version, say, or if I need to do some sort of diagnosis or test something out. It's a really great way to use it. Right, so upgrades work slightly different. We're not going into the upgrade process today, but it's quite well documented for a standard version of Octopus how to upgrade it. With Docker Compose, it's slightly different, and you can see here we have got a notification to say there's a new release available. All you need to do to perform an update is obviously, first of all, back up your database, and there, all you need to do is go in and set that server tag, so the server version tag. Now, the other thing you must set, so anytime you want to respin up these containers, you must make sure you set the master key as well. This means if you don't have that there, you won't be able to access the database. So what we're going to do is just going to run a command to get the container ID. So you can see here, we've got the SQL Server container and the Octopus one. Just going to take that. And I've got a command here which is going to show master key. So it's running just against the Octopus server executable, and it is just hopping into that container. And it's going to run that.
And this is very important, not just for the Docker one, but if you're administrating a Octopus server instance, you definitely need your master key backed up somewhere. So definitely take this same command. If you don't have it somewhere, get the master key. You can get it from the Octopus manager. You can run this command on the command line, get it, put it somewhere safe. Because if you ever need to use a database backup to get all of your sensitive variables and stuff unencrypted, you're going to need that.
Yeah. Yeah, go and do that. The first thing you do. Okay, so there is a slight bug I did notice when I was looking at this, that there's no carriage return, but it's fairly clear to see that we have the master key there. So I'll go and pop that in to the environment file and save that. So we've got the new setting for the version up here and the master key. And what I'll do is I'll stop our instance running, and I'll just run it again, and that will pick up those new parameters. It'll perform the upgrade on the server, and in turn that will then go and run any schema changes against the databases that are required. And in the meantime, the UI notices that the server is down, as it would normally with any Octopus instance, and it's just going to wait and keep polling for that backend to come back up. And once it does, we'll see the screen will refresh again fairly soon. There we go. And you'll also notice up in this notification area here, the server version has been updated, so it's just giving you a notification to refresh the page so your front and back ends match. So we'll reload that. And oops, wrong one. There we go. We can see you've got 2020.3.2. One more thing I did want to mention was we do have this privilege flag set to true. Now, the reason for this is to enable Docker in Docker. So this means that you might have thought, we mentioned execution containers earlier. This flag enables Docker in Docker to run so that within the inbuilt worker, if you're running Octopus in a container, you'll be able to use execution containers. You can disable that though, so it's configurable, but it's just worth noting that you'll still be able to use execution containers. Okay, back to you, Ryan, for a look at Jenkins.
All right. Well, before I go directly into Jenkins, I do want to give a shout out to our Octopus and Jenkins virtual test machines. I'm using one of these for the demo. Matt Casperson, who we've already mentioned once a day, he put these together. And if you want to get started testing Octopus and Jenkins together, it's very straightforward, pretty easy to get these set up and running. I did add the Jenkins pipeline and plugins to these, so I don't think the one I used had that set, or I know the one I used didn't have that set up on the day I set it up. They may have been updated since then, I'm not sure. But there's also a blog post he put together for setting up the Jenkins plugin with Octopus and getting it all configured. So this virtual machine, I'm running it in VirtualBox, combined with that blog post has resulted in a Jenkins pipeline pushing to Octopus, and we're using the updated version of the Octopus plugin for Jenkins that has pipeline support. So you can see I've got my stage view here. I've got 5 stages, including the one they were most concerned about today, which is the deploy stage. Now I can go ahead and kick off a build of this just so that we have one running. And while it is running, I do want to look at the configuration, and we'll see the advanced project options. This is pulling the pipeline script from our GitHub repo. This is our public Octopus samples, and it's looking for a Jenkins file. So if we look at this Jenkins file specifically, again, these will all be in the email that go out, but it's under Octopus samples, organization, random quotes Java, Jenkins file. So pretty standard. If you're already using Jenkins and Jenkins pipeline, a lot of this looks familiar to you. The new piece will be on our deployment stage with the steps that are the steps for manipulating and talking to Octopus directly from your Jenkins pipeline. So we have Octopus pack, Octopus push package, and build information. So we can take your application, the output, put it into a jar file, push it to Octopus with the build information attached to it, create a release, and deploy a release. So similar, if you've used the standard Jenkins plugins, a lot of these options are available there through the classic version. If you're using the CLI currently for any of these commands, all of these parameters are pretty familiar to you, but this is now, you can take these and put these directly in your Jenkins file. And if we head back, it has finished. And from that output, we actually get a link to our release and a link to the deployment that was a part of that execution of that Jenkins project. And if we go in and check the output, we can actually see, the pipeline, the output of the pipeline as it's running, including these commands that it is running from your Jenkins pipeline. Especially with our secrets still being secure, that is an important feature of all of this. You don't want to leak any API keys. And then even getting the output from that Octopus deployment from Jenkins directly. So again, Jenkins plugin, not necessarily new. The new feature here is the ability to use these built-in steps in your Jenkins pipeline file. All right, I think that is it for me. Let's hop back. And before we go to our Q&A, Lianne, I think you have a little bit of information about what's coming up next.
Yeah, we thought we'd just touch on what's coming up on in 2020.4, just to sort of whet everybody's appetites. So you mentioned earlier config as code is coming along, Ryan. We're sort of starting to get changes into the application to enable that project to progress, and that's moving along really nicely. I've seen the engineers demoing the ability to see your Git repository in Octopus and be able to switch between branches. And what's a really awesome feature of this is you can take your project, it can be an existing project. It can be a project that you've got in Octopus, and you can have it in your Git repository. And you don't have to just edit it as code. You can edit it within the UI as well. So they're not mutually exclusive. And I think for me, that's a really sort of flagship feature of the config as code feature. I don't know. Do you agree, Ryan?
I do, because I would probably switch between them just depending on what I'm doing on any given day. But also, I think you can take your existing projects and sync them to Git. It's not going to be for new projects going forward, I believe is the goal.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's going forward. And as Ryan showed, the fact that you only have to save once you've made all of your changes, that will sort of equate to a code commit. So I think that's to help tidy up your Git history. Also, we have better support for our sort of different application config files. So we already have really great support for our .NET sort of developers and with their application config files and web configs and things like that. But we're just making sure things are going to be really working well for YAML files, XML, application properties files. And it's just really sort of bringing things up to an equal level for sort of our Java developers and things like that. And we're also bringing in support for built-in Linux workers on Octopus Cloud. Right now, we've only got access for a Windows Server 2016, and I believe we're bringing that up to Server 2019, and also bringing across the option for a Linux worker. If you want to keep an eye on these things, you can take a look at our roadmap and you can register to get updates on these individual features. You can go to octopus.com/roadmap.
Very cool. Okay. That's good. All right. Yeah. Excited to see even more Linux coming in the future. That's always good to see. All right.
Absolutely.
Let's do some Q&A. So I think we've had a few questions, and I think I have one that would be right up your alley. Can multiple Docker containers run against the same SQL Server instance?
Yes, that is a great question. And that brings us along to something which I didn't mention. So what I would do, this is really talking about high availability. So what we would tend to recommend if you wanted to do that is to start using Kubernetes. In our cloud offering, we use Azure Kubernetes to host Octopus. And if you wanted to set up high availability, that's the best way to do that. If you're going to use the containers, I would recommend using a Kubernetes of your choice.
All right. We have a few Runbook questions. One is the Runbook retention policy. Is there an option to set a lower default across all Runbooks? So going back to the Runbook settings, that new Runbook retention policy feature, there's not a way that I'm aware of to set like a global default for that. What I would look at doing there is probably using a API script to just go through and set them all to your default that you want. So maybe do a comparison. If it's set to 100, set it to 10, set it to whatever you'd like. And what's nice is you could make that a runbook that checks all your other runbooks and have that kind of run nightly or something. So that also catches any new ones that are added. So a little runbook inception there. So yeah, so quick answer, no, not a built-in way to do it through the UI, but definitely something achievable through the API.
Excellent. Could a Runbook update its own retention policy?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't see why not. I'm going to wager, yes, it could update its own settings.
Interesting. Looks like there's another Runbook one there. Is there a way to convert an existing deployment process to a Runbook process?
I believe there is. Let me switch back to Chrome and just show what I would look for. Let me go back to a project that actually has a deployment process. So this one does, and oh, my instance is being a little slow. Yeah, so, oh, it's only got one step. So I don't think you could do a whole process all at one time, but what you can do is clone this, this step into a runbook. So I do have a temporary runbook. That's funny. So I could clone this step into that runbook. So you could clone multiple steps individually into a runbook process.
Right. Awesome. Okay. I was just going to check, see if there's anything else.
Oh yeah, let's check out our Slack channel. Do we have any questions there?
Nope, it all looks good there.
Okay, well, if there are, is there a way to clone all the steps into a runbook via the CLI? CLI, I don't think there's an option to do it, to even clone a step through the CLI. Through the API, probably. So that is, I mentioned it before, and usually in our Getting Started webinars, I kind of like say this over and over. Anything you can do through the UI, you can do through the API. So yes, all of those actions I took to clone that step from the deployment process to a runbook, those are API calls. If you can find what those are, you could put them together into a script to do it all at once. So like get all the steps in a process, iterate over them, clone them into a runbook. That is definitely possible through the API, not the CLI.
And also it's, and I know, again, it's not here yet, but this is a prime case for config as code, and having some sort of core things in there would be brilliant, but I do appreciate, obviously, it's not here yet. Okay, so is there a good way to shift projects between spaces yet? If not, is this planned? Well, at the moment, we do have a little application that, well, a fairly big application actually, that's been written by Bob. He's our VP of Customer Success, and that's a lot of PowerShell scripts working together that you can use to clone between spaces or instances and things like that. And what that will do is take either a lot of parameters, and you can tailor it really quite granular. And there's some things it doesn't do, but you can get that to do. And that's on Octopus Deploy Labs on GitHub. Now, it does come with the caveat that it is not supported. It's as is. If there's any issues, you're more than welcome to raise, oh, I don't know if we're allowed to raise pull requests or not on that one. But,
I think it's on the README whether it is or not. I'd also say the other caveat there is it does have limitations because it does use the API. It can't pull it can't pull sensitive variables across spaces. So that's,
and there's something with tenants, I believe, as well, isn't there?
Yeah. So depending on your use case, there may be a solution in the space cloner. We can include a link to that in the resources as well. But again, like I said, it's more of an experimental, like not fully supported option, but it is a potential solution for you.
And again, that would be sort of an excellent use case for config as code. And again, obviously it's not here quite yet.
Oh, that's a good point. Being able to pick up your project and sync it to a different space through a branch, that a potential solution. I hadn't thought of that yet.
So many possibilities.
But I believe that is it for the Q&A. So thank you for everybody. Again, we are going to send you a recording of this webinar. We're going to send you a boatload of resources, links to blog posts and docs and samples for everything we covered today. Lianne, thanks for co-presenting with me and showing us all the magic of Linux and Docker with Octopus. And thank you to everybody who joined us and who's watched this webinar, and again, given us all the great feedback that we've incorporated into this release. and joining us for a webinar Wednesday. We have a few more coming up 2 weeks from today, deploying to Kubernetes with Octopus. And I believe that's 2 weeks, if my math is right. 2 weeks after that, deploying infrastructure in AWS, both Octo 101 webinars. So get signed up for those if you're interested in either of those topics. Again, thank you for viewing. And until we see you next time, happy deployments.